welcome to a very warm welcome to everyone today on behalf of the Bengal Club's Library Subcommittee to this virtual talk by the renowned author Ashwin Sanghi. Ashwin is counted amongst India's highest-selling English fiction authors. He's written many bestsellers, which I'm sure many of us have read. The Rosabelle Line, the Krishna Key, the Chanakya's Chant, the Sialkot Saga series, the Bharat series, which has the latest Vishnu's Vault, if I'm not wrong. Ashwin, am I right on that?
Yeah, The Vault of Vishnu, that's right.
The Vault of Vishnu, sorry. And of course, he's also collaborated with James Patterson on the New York Times best-selling novels Private India and Private Delhi. I must say that I'm very delighted to own a few of these books, autographed copies, thanks to Ashwin's generosity. Some of these books are underway to being adapted for movies and web series, and I hope Ashwin will tell us which ones. Ashwin has been included in Forbes India Celebrity 100 list, and he's also on the, he won the Crossword Popular Choice Award in 2012. He's won the Lit O Fest Literature Legend Award in 2018, and very recently the Kalinga Popular Choice Award. Ashwin lives in Bombay with his lovely, lovely wife, Anushika, who I must thank for arranging for this talk with Ashwin, and his son, Rajveer. Ashwin, thank you so much for accepting this invite today. We're really looking forward to your discussion on the relevance of Chanakya and Arthashastra in today's times. Ashwin, the format for today's talk is Ashwin will speak for about 25-30 minutes, and then he will take audience questions in the chat box, please. Ashwin, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Nandini, for that very wonderful introduction. And, you know, I must tell you, Nandini, I'm always very worried when I get a very glowing introduction, because that is usually setting the person up for failure, because you've set expectations so high that then it becomes difficult. No matter what you do, you will never be able to deliver against those expectations. So I shall work extra hard at it. I'm wondering as to why sometimes people ask me to talk on the relevance of Chanakya in our times. Truth be told, I mean, ultimately at the end of the day, we as novelists, you know, people, you know, often used to ask me when I had written my first novel, the Rosabelle Line, in 2007, people would ask, you know, that you're an MBA in finance with a business background, and one fine day you get up and decide to write a theological thriller. You know, what is your background which entitles you to do this? And I used to say to them that, you know, during my growing up years, my mother always said that I was a bloody good liar. So I had the ability to be able to spin yarns rather easily. So in that sense, when people read my novels, and those are, of course, novels which are a mixture of fact and fiction, they tend to treat me as some sort of a guru in some ways on that particular subject, not realizing that ultimately I'm just a good storyteller. And that's what I do. But nonetheless, a substantial amount of research is involved in each of my novels. And one of those novels was Chanakya's Chant, which was published sometime in 2011 and 12, went on to become one of my most best-selling books, as it were, and for which I also won a couple of awards. But that book required me to delve much deeper into the life of Chanakya and into the Arthashastra in particular. So I'm going to sort of keep the fiction aside for a moment and just focus on what I gained from that particular exploration and share it with you. That does not qualify me to be an expert on the subject. I'm simply just sharing what I know. In 1960, China's GDP, now the GDP at $2010 was about 128 billion. It would surprise you to know that India's GDP in that same year, in 1960, was significantly higher at around 148.8 billion. But by 1978, China's GDP reached around 293.6 billion and nudged slightly ahead of India's at 293 billion. After that, the gap between India and China only kept widening. And of course, by 2021, that is this current year, China's GDP is roughly around 5.5 times that of India's. Now, to me, it seems, standing at a distance, that China fully absorbed the words of their ancient philosopher and strategist, Sun Tzu. In his work, The Art of War, Sun Tzu advised that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Avoid what is strong and strike at what is weak. And then Sun Tzu went on to say, every battle is won or lost before it is ever fought. Successive governments in India thought that they could fight Chinese aggression through military or diplomatic means, completely ignoring the fact that economic imbalance would be our undoing. Now, what is very surprising is that while China has not forgotten its history and its ancient wisdom, alas, India has. If China can look to Sun Tzu, India has its very own Chanakya, whose strategic, political, and economic views are no less profound than Sun Tzu. Chanakya says that if the ends can be achieved by non-military methods, an armed conflict is not advised. Any activity which harms the progress of the enemy engaged in similar undertakings is also to be considered as progress. But most importantly, Chanakya emphatically says that the prosperous one becomes the victorious one. Why did we pay no heed to this fundamental truth, I wonder? Now, Chanakya, of course, is also known as Kautilya and Vishnugupta, and he was among India's greatest strategists, economists, and statesmen. His writings, including the Arthashastra and the Niti Shastra, are often quoted by management gurus, politicians, and diplomats. Born around 375 BCE, Chanakya is believed to have devised the diplomatic, the political, military, and economic strategy by which Emperor Chandragupta was able to seize power and, of course, fashion the mighty Mauryan Empire. In fact, in some ways, Chanakya is probably India's first political scientist and economist. It is a puzzle to me why we forgot him. And why do we condescendingly call him the Indian Machiavelli? After all, Niccolo Machiavelli lived almost 1,850 years after Chanakya and his political treatise. The political treatise written by Machiavelli, known as The Prince, does not even cover a fraction of Chanakya's intellectual landscape. And yet we have ignored Chanakya and given him this rather demeaning title of the Indian Machiavelli. Now, I wonder that could this apathy be attributed to the fact that the Arthashastra remained lost in the sands of time for many, many centuries after the decline of the Mauryan Empire. It was only in 1904 that a palm leaf text written in the ancient Grantha script was gifted by a Tamil Brahmin from Tanjore to the newly established Mysore Oriental Library that had been founded by the region's Wadiyar kings. And the writings on the leaves were soon identified as the lost work of Chanakya by Sanskrit scholar Dr. Shama Shastri. Shama Shastri not only transcribed the manuscript in 1909, but also translated it into English in 1915. And suddenly the world rediscovered Chanakya and his wisdom. Until then, India's British rulers had assumed that our native ideas of governance had been borrowed from the Greeks. The rediscovery of Chanakya put paid to those notions. Unfortunately, what is it that we really did with Chanakya's wisdom after we rediscovered it? Alas, the answer is very little. For example, take Chanakya's views on taxation. Chanakya says in his Arthashastra, just as one plucks fruits from a garden as they ripen, so shall a king have revenue collected as it becomes due. Just as one does not collect unripe fruits, he shall avoid taking tax that is not due, because that will make the people angry and spoil the very sources of revenue. Now, these were words that were penned 2,300 years ago. But today, ask any Indian entrepreneur or foreign investor, and might I add, especially Vodafone or Cairn Energy or the likes, and they will tell you that the biggest obstacle to Indian growth is the complicated taxation policy, the arbitrary orders, and incompetent tax administration. But Chanakya seemed to have got his motivations completely right 2,300 years ago. Similarly, if you look at it, over the past few decades, we Indians have become almost thick-skinned when we are confronted by scams and corruption. It's almost become a way of life. But 2 millennia ago, Chanakya was cognizant of the problem. Chanakya wrote, just as it is impossible to know when a fish moving in water is drinking it, so it is impossible to find out when government servants in charge of undertakings misappropriate money. What a wonderful metaphor, that just as you cannot figure out when a fish is drinking water, you can't figure out when government servants are skimming money. But Chanakya did not stop at simply recognizing the problem. Instead, he devised several checks and balances to minimize the problem. For example, he mandated that government officials could not be relatives of the king. What Chanakya wanted to ensure was that the king would have the freedom to punish those officers when they indulged in malfeasance. He knew that the king might have his hands tied when it came down to relatives. So he prescribed the rule that no relative of the king can be in charge of government departments. Similarly, every government department was required to maintain profit center accounts and to submit to an annual audit. And get this, they were required to follow a uniform lunar accounting year consisting of 354 days. Now, all of this sounds very, very normal. It sounds almost like a discussion happening at an accounting firm. But remember, this was 2,300 years ago, where he prescribed the accounting year, he prescribed the nature of accounts that had to be followed, and he created a department known as the controller and auditor who had to audit those accounts. And these government officials had to present themselves in order to submit themselves for audit. Similarly, if you go into the geopolitical sphere, Chanakya was way, way ahead with his Raja Mandala theory. Chanakya said, your neighbor is your natural enemy and your neighbor's neighbor is your friend. Just observe India's neighborhood and you would instantly see the importance of his words. And it was in the context of the Raja Mandala theory that Chanakya outlined his strategies of Sam, Dan, Bhed, and Dand. He advised very emphatically that the first method applied in any situation should be one of Sam, which is conciliation, persuasion, gentle praise. If that doesn't work, then step 2 is Dan, rewards, gifts, monetary benefits, and of course, even bribes if required. Then one can employ stealth, intelligence, propaganda, and covert operations, which is Bhed. And finally, if all options are exhausted, one employs Dand, which is force, military action, or punishment. Chanakya was unabashed about not being too idealistic or too rigid in one's principles. There's no point in being too upright, he wrote. You would see that by going to the forest, the straight trees are cut down while the crooked ones are left standing. So it's very interesting to sort of think about this in the context of today, that where you need to have that little bit of ambiguity, that flexibility, and lack of necessarily a too moral and upright a posture in order to be able to negotiate the dynamics of the fast evolving geopolitical neighborhood that you live in. But even beyond governance, the principles of the Arthashastra can be applied to the world of modern management almost seamlessly. So let's not think of this as only an ancient manual for governance. For example, Chanakya said, a king can only reign with the help of others. One wheel on its own does not move a chariot. Does that sound familiar to you? I mean, it was Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, who said that great things in business are never done by one person, they are done by a team of people. And virtually every management book will talk about the value of teamwork. But the intrinsic value of teamwork shines through in Chanakya's words. Take another management idea, that of time management. Chanakya says that time perfects all living beings as well as kills them. Time alone is awake when all others are asleep. Even a minute of one's life cannot be obtained, even for 1,000,000 gold coins. If time is not used purposefully, what loss can be bigger than that? I mean, sometimes I feel as if when I'm reading the Arthashastra, I sometimes feel as if I'm reading an ancient prescription written by the McKinsey of that time, whether it is in terms of governance advice or whether it's in terms of management theory. Revisit any of the great ideas of successful entrepreneurs and managers, and chances are that Chanakya would have enunciated those principles in his unique style aeons ago. For example, Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, said nothing else can quite substitute for a few well-chosen, well-timed, sincere words of praise. They are absolutely free and worth a fortune. But if we travel back 2,300 years in time, Chanakya said in a very similar fashion, always speak what would please the man from whom we expect a favor, like the hunter who sings sweetly when he desires to shoot a deer. The founder of the Reliance empire, Dhirubhai Ambani, was known to say, I am willing to salute anyone for my work. One thing you won't find in me, and that's an ego. It's incredible to note that Chanakya wrote, virtuous people and fruit-laden trees bow, but fools and dry sticks break because they are unwilling to bend. Take another concept within modern management, which is the value of perception. The value of perception in the world of marketing was underlined by the founder of Tesla, Elon Musk, who famously quipped, "Brand is just a perception, and perception will match reality over time." Would it surprise you to know that Chanakya also addressed this notion of perception? Chanakya wrote, "Even if a snake is not poisonous, it should pretend to be venomous." He was almost echoing the words of Sun Tzu, who said in similar fashion, "When able, we should seem unable. When we are in action, we must seem inactive. When near, we should seem far. When far, the enemy should think we are near." Incredible wisdom from ancient times. Well, the world remembers Chanakya as the shrewd and ruthless tactician. We seem to have forgotten his contribution to the idea of good governance. The word Arthashastra is a combination of two words, Artha and Shastra. The former means wealth or well-being. The latter means science. So the resultant word Arthashastra denotes the science of prosperity. Chanakya's work almost reads like a consulting report containing economic prescriptions for a country. There is virtually no aspect of state administration that Chanakya does not address. He defines the daily routine of the monarch, civil and criminal penalties, operations of the secret service, the tax structure. He even defines the width of chariot roads so that one chariot can overtake another during times of war. How to organize the mining industry, organization structure of the government departments. He talks about animal husbandry and how relevant it is to the economy. He talks about how to boost agriculture. He identifies bureaucratic employment rules. He identifies areas that require consumer protection. He describes judicial procedures, disaster management, property rights, infrastructure development, drainage planning, food security, policing, textiles, interest rates, labor regulation, defense management, urban planning, foreign policy, currency control, weights and measures, food rations, and several others. I mean, I could go on for another 10 minutes describing to you the things that he has talked about. But something worth noting is the absence of moralizing in Chanakya's economic construct. Think about this. We live in a world where Canada, Mexico, South Africa, Uruguay, Georgia, the Australian Capital Region, and 18 states of the United States have legalized the recreational use of cannabis. In most non-Islamic countries, alcohol is permitted but is heavily taxed. Across the world, nicotine is a major source of revenue for government, although the harmful effects of tobacco are well known. Now, would it surprise you to note that in the Mauryan state, the manufacture and sale of alcoholic drinks was a state monopoly, so was gambling and prostitution. Clearly missing from Chanakya's prescription is any moral judgment. Chanakya knew that vices are simply driven underground if they are outlawed. Instead, he turned them into valuable sources of state revenue. Far ahead of his times, wouldn't you agree? "It's the economy, stupid," was a phrase that was coined by the Bill Clinton camp for the 1992 American presidential race. It was meant to reflect the fact that everything else would take care of itself if the economy prospered. We take the overarching importance of the economy as a given in the 21st century. But 2,300 years ago, Chanakya wrote, "The root of wealth is economic activity, and lack of it brings material distress. In the absence of fruitful economic activity, both current prosperity and future growth are in danger of destruction." So I would consider this statement of Chanakya to be the equivalent of Bill Clinton's statement, "It's the economy, stupid." By now, Chanakya's strategy should have been ingrained into our intelligence services and into our think tanks. Chanakya's management ideas should have become part of the standard curriculum of MBA programs. Chanakya's economic principles should have found their way into policy framing. We pay lip service to Chanakya, but refuse to take a deep dive into his ideas. I genuinely believe that the organization structures of the 20th century were in some ways rigid and hierarchical, almost top-down driven, Abrahamic sort of, thou shalt, almost like the 10 Commandments, driven in that fashion where there is a set of orders conveyed from top to down and which has to be followed. On the other hand, entities of the 21st centuries are far more non-hierarchical with lesser definitive prescriptions. Be it the vibrant startup culture in India or the elevations of the likes of Satya Nadella or Sundar Pichai or Parag Agarwal as the CEOs of Microsoft, Google, or Twitter, they all point towards a global acceptance of Indian talent. This is the moment when India should be recapturing its ancient wisdom. Even when Chanakya wrote his Arthashastra, he admitted that he was repackaging the wisdom of earlier teachers such as Brihaspati, Ushanas, Parashar, Vishalaksh, Bhardwaj, and many others. It's time to revisit that wisdom. Most Indians know of the Mahabharata only as the great war between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, but they don't necessarily know that the 12th book of the 18 books that constitute the epic is the Shanti Parva, a book that encapsulates the duties of the ruler, the dharma, and good governance. So it is not only wisdom from the Arthashastra and Chanakya that needs to be recaptured, but all of our ancient wisdom. And the symbol of all of that is Chanakya and his relevance in our times. My generation grew up reading Amar Chitra Katha comic books, books that included tales from the Panchatantra. Little did we realize that there was a king in Kashmir who was terrified about handing over the reins of his kingdom to any of his 3 spoiled brat sons. The Panchatantra was written sometime between 200 BC and 300 CE in order to teach them good values through the medium of entertaining fables. The authorship of the Panchatantra was attributed to either someone called Vasu Bhaga or Vishnu Sharma, possibly the very same man that we call Chanakya. The Panchatantra was what we now call edutainment, teaching through entertaining. It was so effective that it was carried back to Persia by a physician called Borzuya in the 6th century, who translated it into Persian. In Persia, it became the basis for the training of their bureaucracy. 3 centuries later, it was translated into Arabic by Abdullah ibn al-Muqaffa, and it became a work known as the Kalila wa Dimna, named after the 2 jackals who are the primary characters of the stories. It became so popular that it was translated to German and published by Gutenberg in 1480. Around the world, over 100 translations exist today of the Panchatantra. Surely there are ideas for good governance and just administration within it that would be equally relevant even today. With all his pragmatism and ruthlessness, there is a nobility of purpose that shines through in Chanakya's world. Much before philanthropy and corporate social responsibility became buzzwords, Chanakya explained, it is essential for stagnant water to have a little flow for its purity, and it is necessary to donate part of one's wealth for its protection. I wonder whether John Rockefeller had read Chanakya's work when he said, giving should be entered into just as the same way as investing. Giving is investing. To end this talk of mine, let me leave you with a sentence that resonates with me from all of the things that Chanakya has talked about. And this also resonates and matches up with a statement made by the founders of Google, who, when they had initially gone in for their IPO, they said, they defined their motto. They said, we have a mantra, don't be evil, which is to do the best things we know how for our users, for our customers, and for everyone. That was the motto of the founders of Google. But think about this. 2,300 years ago, Chanakya said, in the happiness of his subjects lies the king's happiness. In their welfare, his welfare. He shall not consider as good only that which pleases him, but treat as beneficial to him whatever pleases his subjects. I think it's a time when we should all pause and think about this amazing individual called Kautilya and this incredible work called the Arthashastra. I am truly fortunate that I had a chance to dig into his life as part of researching for my novel Chanakya's Chant. Had that story idea not been there, I may not have ended up reading the Arthashastra, the Niti Shastra, and Mudra Rakshas, all three which formed the backbone of my novel. But I'm even more delighted that I got an opportunity to share some of these learnings with you. And I'm happy to stay on here for as much time as Nandini requests me to, in order to have a frank discussion with you. And I shall do my best to answer any questions or issues or comments or observations that you may have. So thank you for inviting me here, and I look forward to chatting with you.
Ashwin, thank you so much. That was like a short crash course on economics and economy, and like I don't know what else. That's absolutely. I'm sure I'm going to go back and see it again just to take down notes. I'm going to ask you one question before I let you go to the chat box. Sure. In your book, Chanakya's Chant, there is this one set of questions, which is what you were addressing about the king's duty and all of that. And there's this one very interesting chapter where Chanakya is being has rapid fire questions from students, and they were all very tongue-in-cheek, that why is the government so secretive, or does the king always have to say the truth? Are those also in the Arthashastra, or they are part of
Nandini, I started out this talk by saying that we as novelists are bloody good liars. Okay, so when you read something like Chanakya's Chant, in fact, so many people ask me how much of it is fiction and how much of it is fact. And I always attach one disclaimer to all of my novels. I say, even though I've liberally used factual information, read the entire work as a work of fiction. That section which you are talking about, in fact, if you flip to the back of the book, you will find that I have taken a lot of inspiration from the words of people like, for example, Winston Churchill, I have taken inspiration from popular series such as Yes Minister in order to look at what would be, like, for example, if you don't want to discuss something, then let it be the last item on the agenda before lunch.
That resonated.
Exactly. So I mean, the point is, the idea of, I have always believed that we as novelists, we have, I call it the 3 E's. My first objective, and the 3 E's follow what is known as the 70-20-10 rule. The 70% of your job as a writer or a storyteller is to entertain. Because if I cannot entertain you, you will not turn the page.
I agree.
And if you do not turn the page, you will not work your way through the book. So my primary responsibility is to entertain you. That accounts for 70%. 20% of my responsibility is to maybe open you up to certain facts that you were not aware of earlier.
Like the Oxford debate.
Exactly. So there may be certain things that you will come across in an Ashwin Sanghi book, which are actually derived from fact. And then you would say, oh, that's an interesting little nugget of information. I didn't know that. That is where the educate bit comes in. And the final 10% is really what I call the moment of enlightenment, where by the time that you reach the last page of the book, I would like you to have a batti on moment, jahan par batti on ho jati hai, and you suddenly say, why didn't I think of this issue in this way? What was I thinking? It's almost that aha moment. And I call it the moment of enlightenment. So I have 3 very clear objectives in front of me. Entertain 70%, educate 20%, enlighten 10%. So please do not treat Chanakya's Chant or any other book of Ashwin Sanghi as any great words of wisdom. Ultimately, at the end of the day, they are pot boilers which are meant to entertain.
Ashwin, I must tell you that I had stopped reading historical fiction for this reason, because I couldn't figure out what I ended up, in a party saying something from one of the other books I'd read of another author as fact. And I was told, no, this is completely fiction. But I think your books took me back to the mythological fiction, sort of historical fiction genre. So, Ashwin, can you see the chat box?
Yes, I can.
So I think there are 2 questions there, if you could take them.
Sure. Does he have anyone in mind from within contemporary Indian leaders who may resemble Chanakya? This is a question from Ambrish ji, and I hope he doesn't end up putting me into a spot here. But nevertheless, I would say that there have been many. In fact, if you really think about what I have done in Chanakya's Chant is I've created, there are 2 parallel stories running through this novel. There is the story of modern day India with a leader known as Gangasagar Mishra, who becomes the kingmaker for an Indian prime minister. And on the other hand, you have a parallel story occurring 2300 years ago, where Chanakya is attempting to make Chandragupta Maurya into the king. Now, to answer Ambrish ji's question, the best is to look at the character of Gangasagar Mishra, because Gangasagar Mishra is today's version of Chanakya, right? So where have I drawn my inspiration for Gangasagar Mishra? And actually, when people think, when they read it, they look at different parts of Gangasagar Mishra's personality, and they say, oh, because this is a UP politician who was able to completely upset the apple cart, this could be Mayawati. Someone else will read it and they will say, oh, no, he is definitely talking about Amit Shah. They completely forget the fact that Amit Shah came onto the national scene only in 2014, whereas this book was written in 2010. So I certainly did not have Amit Shah in my mind at that time. Then there are those who will say, oh, this guy has the ability to carry so many people with him. He is definitely talking about Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And then someone else will look at it and say, oh, Ganga Sagar has this uncanny ability of being able to get people who are even his enemies to do precisely what he wants. So probably Ashwin is talking about Narasimha Rao. The truth lies in the answer, yes. I was thinking about them, but all of them. There was no one single politician that I was thinking about. I was thinking about multiple politicians, and I took certain character traits of multiple contemporary politicians because there were several character traits that came together, coalesced, and created this persona of Ganga Sagar, who is modern day depiction of Chanakya. So if you ask me, who is the modern day equivalent of Chanakya? There are many modern day equivalents of Chanakya, but I have yet to come across one who covers all the bases, because today we have some great politicians who are politically astute, but they don't necessarily have the economic wisdom of Chanakya. There are those who have tremendous economic clout, like, let's say, for example, Dr. Manmohan Singh, but they don't have the political wiliness and the shrewdness of a Chanakya. There are those, for example, who have the political wiliness and the cunning and the strategic approach of a Chanakya, but they don't have the national vision which Chanakya has. Even though we consider him to be this very, very cunning and scheming character, but there is a simplicity and a nobility of purpose that shines through in the Arthashastra by the time you're done reading it. And that's the time when you realize that, okay, all of this that he is talking about is something which is done with a greater national purpose in mind. It is for the good it is for the wider good. And that shines through in the Arthashastra. So there was, should I move on to another question, Nandini?
Yes, Ashwin, there's one more question.
There is a second question, which is from Prashant Sharma.
Yes.
Who says, Ashwin, why do you think we did not follow Chanakya's wise teachings? Oh, don't even get me started, Prashantji, on this. I think partly, as I mentioned, there was a very, very long gap between Chanakya's work, which continued to remain the crux and the basis for governance and administration for many years of the Mauryan Empire. But after that, for whatever reasons, the work remained lost, technically remained lost, and probably it was in plain sight, but it had to be rediscovered. And as we know, it was the palm leaf manuscripts of the Arthashastra were only actually rediscovered as they were in 1904. So we went through a very, very long patch, particularly most of the British era and most of the Mughal era, without having had any reference to Chanakya's work. We had references to the Arthashastra and Chanakya's work in other works, but we didn't have the work itself. So we lost a large portion of our historical narrative without the actual work in hand, number one. Number two is that by the time we did rediscover him, and by the time the translations happened and the transcriptions happened, by then we were moving, it was the last few decades of British rule. And by the time that 1947 came along, the entire focus was in terms of building up industry. And at that point of time, as just a freshly liberated colonial nation, our entire fascination still remained with the West. So those entire Nehruvian years were pretty much we were looking to the West for inspiration, whether it was in terms of what was in vogue that time in terms of policy, the entire idea of socialism as the framework, the notion of, for example, non-alignment, the notions of, for example, the leading lights of the public sector, the bag that we inherited of the mixed economy. All of these were things that we were in some ways picking up, absorbing from the West, as a result of which our own intrinsic knowledge was put to the side. It was like, oh, no, this is not the way we need to do it. If there is someone who has said this in the form of a management guru from England or the US or from France or Germany, well, that has greater relevance than something that has been said by one of our own ancient seekers of knowledge. So I think we have gone through this entire period of time of almost around 40, 50 years, where we paid scant importance to Chanakya. And frankly, even now, even though Chanakya is now part of our popular discourse, frankly, we are only paying lip service to him. Because by now, we could have actually taken on board Chanakya's thoughts and his wisdom and actually hardwired it into many, many aspects of our governance and of our administration, which we have actually not done. In fact, it's sad to think about, but my gut instinct tells me that probably there are more Chinese strategic thinkers who have absorbed the Arthashastra and Chanakya's words than people within the Indian strategic environment. So while the Arthashastra has become a part and parcel of the way that the world around us is thinking strategically, we are yet to give it the sort of value that we need to.
Thank you, Ashwin. I completely agree with you. In fact, there is a book called The 100-Year Marathon, which basically outlines the, have you come across it?
Yes.
And it outlines the 100-year policy. And if you read that book, some of the stuff they say, it kind of resonates with what you've been saying today about, if you are near, let the enemy think you're far. If you're far, let the enemy think you're near. So, a lot of this, the economic stuff as well, like you don't let people come to know us, governance. So I think I completely understand what you're saying. Ashwin, sorry.
No, I think to a certain extent, what has also happened is that over the years, we have somewhere along the way, we have the link between actual governance, administration, management, and the wisdom of Chanakya. That link somewhere has been lost. I mean, take for example today a simple thing like we take it for granted that in the world of finance there is what is known as the so-called risk return reward, right, Nandini?
Yes.
So
yes.
If you are willing to absorb a higher level of risk, then you should be rewarded that much more. And on the other hand, in case you are taking on a moderate level of risk, then it's moderate reward. But if you go back into the Arthashastra, you would find that actually Chanakya specifies the rates of interest that could be applied to various transactions. For example, if you were undertaking a normal transaction, the rate of interest prescribed by the Arthashastra is about 1.25% per month, which is roughly around 15% per year. On the other hand, if you are undertaking not the borrowing for a personal need, but for a commercial transaction, then he prescribes the rate as 5% per month, which is 60% per annum. If you are undertaking risky travel for business, which is through the forest, then it becomes even riskier. So it is 10% per month or 120% per annum. And if you are undertaking risky travel through the seas for trade, then it's 20% per month. In other words, 240% a year. So now you see intrinsically what he has already captured is the essence of risk reward.
Right.
He does not talk about higher risk, higher reward, but he explains it to you in the form of the model. So the point I'm making is that a lot of this stuff, which we have sort of paid little heed to, is right there in front of us. It's only a question of making this, contextualizing this in terms of our own situation as a country, or as a enterprise, or as what have you. I mean, if I had to sort of think about this really in terms of it was the great investor, Warren Buffett. He had this wonderful little 2-rule thing, which was like rule number 1, never lose money, and rule number 2, never forget rule number 1. I'm sure you must be aware of that, right? I mean, that was his sort of golden mantra, as it were. But in today's times, if you really think about Chanakya, and you were to add a rule number 3 and a rule number 4, rule number 3 of Chanakya would be virtuous, honest, and upright in your dealings. And then rule number 4 would be occasionally forget rule number 3. And that would pretty much sum up Chanakya in a nutshell,
That is fantastic, Ashwin. Before I call upon Chaitali Di to give the vote of thanks, may I just suggest that if you haven't already, do look up this book called Those Days and the First Light by Sunil Gangopadhyay. It's based in Bengal. 1830 to 1870 is the first time period, and then 1817 to 1910. And it's one of the few historical fiction books which I think have done really well, and like yours, have got the entertainment and the factual bit just in the correct proportions. In fact, the author won the Sahitya Kala Academy for this magnum opus. So that's something that we will be sending to you, and we hope you like it.
Thank you very much, Nandini, and it has been a pleasure to be here with all of you.
Ashwin, I'm going to ask Chaitali Di to come and give you the vote of thanks.
Of course.
Chaitali Di, if you could just come on to the screen, please.
Thank you, Nandini, and good evening, everyone. The President, the Chairperson, and every member of the Library Subcommittee of Bengal Club, Kolkata, joins me in thanking Mr. Ashwin Sanghi profusely for this superlatively engaging talk this evening. I feel like saying that it is the eve of the Christmas Eve, and it's a wonderful time. Sir, thank you for making us think of perspectives in words like stealth, propaganda, bribes, moral uprightness, and many more. Thank you, sir. Heartfelt thanks to the audience for their participation. Thanks to my colleague, Nandini Khaitan, for introducing today's speaker and taking the session along so well. And finally, thanks to Gurudas for taking care of the technicalities of this virtual session. Thanks, good evening again, and goodbye.
Thank you, Chaitali Ji. Thank you to all the audience members who have been patiently sitting through my talk. And thank you, Nandini, for inviting me. I've been delighted to be here. So pleasure was entirely mine.
Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you, Chaitali Di. Have a good evening, everybody.
Take care. Bye.